had called his wife in New York and suggested they look for a chalet here. They both loved to ski so much it only made sense. Kravis's only condition was that he be able to ski in and out of the new house. Together, they had tramped through home after home, never finding the perfect one. Finally, they came on the right hillside, although the house atop it appeared to be a disaster. At least it looked that way from the outside. Kravis and Carolyn never actually went in, but simply bought it, tore it down, and had a new home designed in its place. The result, a Tyrolean symphony of stone, wood, and glass, had been finished at Thanksgiving a year earlier. They named it Woodhaven. Kravis loved it. The house was surrounded by towering silver aspens, and the air smelled of pine. Inside, the living room was dominated by a massive 17th-century French hearth and 24-foot arched windows overlooking the slopes. The library's intricate paneling was of Hawaiian koa wood, hand-tooled and rubbed by an Austrian-born artisan who spent months on the task. Kravis had stopped talking about the deal the minute they arrived. Only once did Rome bring it up. "What do you think you're going to do?" she wondered. "I don't know," Kravis replied. Rome again searched for clues in her husband's face, but found none. "He was playing the great poker hand," she said later. "He played it very close to the vest, even with me." On Thanksgiving, they celebrated their 3rd wedding anniversary. Carolyn gave Kravis a 2-week-old black Labrador retriever. Actually, she gave him a picture of herself with the puppy in her arms. Kravis already had a yellow lab named Christy, which Rome had given him for Christmas 2 years earlier. "What are you going to name the dog?" one of Kravis's children asked. Kravis thought a moment. "If we end up bidding for RJR Nabisco, and if we win, his name's going to be Nabisco. If we don't get it, we'll have to figure out another name." The kids weren't too hot on Nabisco. "Why don't we call him Oreo instead?" one suggested. Kravis was on his way to the slopes Saturday morning when he returned a call from Paul Rather. "Have you talked to George yet?" Rather wondered. "No, have you?" "Yeah, yesterday." "Where is he?" "He's not sure he wants to do this at all." "Where are you?" Kravis asked. "Geez, you know where I am," Rather said. "I've always been more bullish on this than George." They debated for a while about how intransigent Roberts would be and agreed to meet first thing Monday to plan their strategy. "You know George won't want to leave till Monday morning," Kravis reminded him. Roberts hated New York so much he tended to hang on to every last minute of California time. "We really ought to get together Monday night, then," Rather said. By the weekend, the drumbeat that had begun so quietly in the days before Thanksgiving was growing louder and louder. All weekend, Shearson and the management team heard the same message repeated from every corner. Kravis won't be there. Kravis won't be there. Kravis won't be back. Through every back channel, from every Kravis investment banker and lawyer, the rumor spread. Relaxing in Connecticut, Jim and Linda Robinson heard it and recalled Linda's strange conversation with Kravis. In the Hamptons, Peter Cohen heard it and thought of his talk with Dick Beatty. In his home on the North Shore of Long Island, Tom Hill heard it and thought of his own discussions with Bruce Wasserstein. The rumor spread to each of the Solomon sausages and through the ranks at Lazard and Dillon Reed. In Florida, Johnson heard it from Linda Robinson. All of them heard the same thing. Kravis was bidding low, if he was bidding at all. The question was, would they believe it? Jim Maher's team worked feverishly through the weekend, inching toward the Tuesday deadline. Among the sundry investors roped into the bid was a British sugar company named S&W Beresford. Jay Pritzker held an 11% stake in Beresford, which also paid Jerry Seslow for financial advice. Seslow had penciled in the British company for $100 million of the $1.2 billion in equity First Boston needed. Saturday, the group's tax attorneys ruled that, of the $250 million in equity required for buying Nabisco itself, at least half must come from a third party unaffiliated with the Pritzkers or First Boston. Seslow immediately thought of Beresford. Two of the British company's senior executives were in New York, but no one could find them. Seslow phoned Beresford's chief financial officer in London, who reminded the accountant why he couldn't locate the men. They were Orthodox Jews. They couldn't work on the Sabbath or even answer the phone. Seslow waited all day. Shortly after sunset, he took a call from Howard Zuckerman, head of Beresford's U.S. operations. "Howard, we need a commitment within 2 days." "If it's so important," Zuckerman replied, "how about meeting tonight?" "Wonderful," Seslow said. "Come on over." Fennebresque greeted the two Beresford executives when they arrived at First Boston that evening. Ushering them into a conference room, he thought he heard a young First Boston associate softly whistling. Fennebresque turned and looked at Beresford's chairman, Ephraim Margulies, and immediately recognized the tune. It was the theme from Alfred Hitchcock's 1950s television show. Margulies was the spitting image of the renowned British director. Fennebresque's food team made a 45-minute presentation. Afterward, Maher-Zaid was pleased. He thought the odds good that the Beresford people could make their decision by Tuesday. 20 minutes later, Howard Zuckerman took Fennebresque aside. "We'll do it." Fennebresque didn't understand. "You'll do what?" "We'll take the $125 million. Fennebresque watched in disbelief as Zuckerman picked up a discarded pizza box and, on its rear flap, scribbled out a wire authorizing Beresford's London office to make the investment. He had never seen anyone work so fast. Brian Finn turned to Hank Hendelsman and asked, smiling, "Do these people have any idea what they're doing?" "No," Hendelsman said. "Not really. Why?" "Well, it's important, I would think. I mean, they're going to commit $125 million. Why should they do it?" Handelsman stared at Finn as if it was the silliest question he'd ever heard. Jay asked them to. Monday morning, Felix Roeden convened a meeting of the board advisors in conference room 32C at Lazard. Inside the firm, 32C was known as the Queen of Conference Rooms. It had paneling. There was much to do in the final 36 hours before bids were due. Everyone had heard the worrisome rumors about Kravis. If that weren't bad enough, ominous noises were beginning to emanate from First Boston as well. No longer could they be certain that either group would bid tomorrow. Now, more than ever, they had to examine the feasibility of a restructuring. Luis Rinaldini had worked long hours formulating the plan and was convinced it would work. Others, including Roeden, had their doubts. What happened to the company after that? And most important, who would run it? "How do you run a recap without management?" Roeden asked rhetorically. Johnson would have smiled had he known the only candidate to step forward and offer to assume that leadership. It was John Macamur, the same Macamur who, as a special committee member, now sat in judgment of Johnson and who, on at least 2 prior occasions, had been involved in aborted attempts to head RJR Nabisco. When the subject of a restructuring had come up weeks earlier, Macamur had approached Hugel and volunteered to run the company if Johnson was thrown out. It was no coincidence that Macamur was also the biggest supporter of the recap among the 5 committee members. The advisors decided to take a risk. If they were certain the recap could be valued at $100 a share, why not let the bidders know it? That way they could set a bidding floor, hinting pointedly that the board stood ready to reject anything less. It was a bluff, more or less, and while directed mainly at the management group, fairness dictated the same message be passed to all 3. Therein lay the gamble. Laying a $100 floor might be enough to scare off at least one of the other bidders. First stop on the board's 11th-hour drive was the management group. Monday at 12:30, a Shearson-Solomon contingent led by Tom Hill met with a squad of board advisors at Dillon Read. To the board bankers, Hill seemed unbelievably cocky. He had fallen hook, line, and sinker for Kravis's disappearing act, and First Boston, he said, was a joke, an airball. In a sidebar conversation with his golfing buddy Rinaldini, Hill put his fists together and pumped them up and down, mimicking a bellows, as if to suggest the board had been pumping up another player to roll out against Kravis and Johnson. Hill was his usual arrogant self, recalled one of the committee bankers, only worse. Dillon and Lazard brought several messages for Hill's group. One, firm up your securities. Unlike the Kravis securities, Shearson's had no reset mechanisms that, in effect, guaranteed a security would trade at a certain number over time. Shearson's junk bonds could float up or down at will, leaving the buyer open to the vagaries of the market. The board advisors also rolled out the $100 recap plan. Anything less, they suggested, would be rejected as inadequate. Rather than thanking them, Hill fought every suggestion. There was nothing wrong with their securities, he said, and the recap, a bluff. That day, Hill was a man who thought he held all the cards. The bankers wasted little time arguing. If Hill chose to ignore them, it was his funeral. Monday afternoon, Felix Roeden passed on similar messages to Jim Robinson and Henry Kravis, who had returned to New York Sunday evening. I'm not sure what we're going to do, Kravis told Roeden. I don't know if I'm going to bid at all. I've just had all this bad publicity. Roeden encouraged Kravis to bid. Winning will only help your public posture, Henry. You've been hurt as much as you're going to be. I can't imagine your public posture would be any worse if you won than if you just dropped out. Monday afternoon, with 24 hours to go, the Kravis troops remained scattered. Rather, having returned from Florida, had driven to New England to move his daughter into a new private school. That morning, he was buying supplies in a hardware store in Manchester, Vermont. By noon, he was pounding hooks into the walls of his daughter's dorm room. Roberts was in the air over the Midwest. Both were due in by late afternoon. That evening, Kravis hosted a dinner for Roberts, Rather, and a dozen others from the firm. Gathered beneath the Marquis of Londonderry's stern gaze, they talked about what a victory would mean for the firm. For the most part, eschewing financial details, they worried about the repercussions from Washington, life in the media spotlight, and the practical difficulties of swallowing a company the size of RJR Nabisco. The firm only had 15 deal-makers. Did it want to buy a company that would require the attention of 8 or 9? To Rather's consternation, Roberts remained downbeat. Let's just not bid, Roberts urged at one point. No, George, come on, Rather said. We can't do that. If we don't want to bid, let's at least reaffirm our earlier position. They talked for a time about what bothered each of them, but the issue of their bid remained unresolved. Tomorrow would tell. On Monday, First Boston's carefully wound ball of string began to unravel. The first to falter was Jerry Seslow. Pritzker's aide had gathered from his investors informal commitments totaling more than $600 million, half again the $400 million he needed. Almost all, though, were contingent on meeting with First Boston and reviewing RJR Nabisco's financial data. Seslow arranged to assemble his stable at First Boston Monday afternoon for a presentation, after which he planned to rake in formal pledges. Skadden Arps, always edgy about the issue of pre-selling, okayed Seslow's plan, but with a caveat. To attend the meeting, Seslow's people would have to sign a confidentiality agreement. No sooner had Seslow faxed a copy of the agreement to each of the investors than objections came flying back. Among its clauses was one limiting the sale of RJR stock. Nearly all Seslow's backers were active stock players and had accumulated large RJR positions. Men like Martin Gruss, the New York investor, pointed out to Seslow that signing the agreement would lock them into their positions, leaving them vulnerable to massive losses should the inflated stock somehow collapse. One by one, Seslow's investors began backing out. No, Seslow moaned as the impact sank in. This is complete bullshit. This is a catch-22. They won't invest until they meet with First Boston. This is a disaster. Skadden Arps refused to budge on the agreements. Seslow did the only thing he could. He panicked. All Monday and into Tuesday, he scrambled for commitments. Not all his investors held stock. Maher and the Pritzkers looked on warily, hoping Seslow could come up with the money by 5 o'clock. At least the bank situation had firmed up. Against all odds, First Boston's bank team was nearing success. It hadn't been easy. Every major U.S. bank was committed to helping Kravis or the Shearson Group. None was enthusiastic about fielding a third team to help First Boston's iffy bid. The Japanese banks had their own problems. "We'd love to work with you," one Tokyo banker told First Boston's Dave Batten, "but we're already working with 2 other groups, and we've run out of people who speak English." Somehow, Greg Malcolm had managed to gain multi-billion-dollar pledges from Credit Suisse and a French bank for the tobacco half of their plan. All that remained was for Chase Manhattan to finish work on the monetization proposal. Monday afternoon, Malcolm took a call from David Maletta, First Boston's liaison to the banks on the monetization project. With any luck, Malcolm thought, Chase Manhattan had finally signed off. "We've got a big fucking problem," Maletta said. "What's the problem?" "Chase won't do it." Malcolm's heart sank. "You're kidding." "No, I'm not." "What happened?" First Boston had crawled upward through layer after layer of bureaucracy, Maletta explained, only to be tomahawked by Chase Manhattan's senior credit officer. Malcolm was stunned. When Jim Maher heard the news, he closed his eyes. "We're in big trouble." Time magazine hit the newsstands Monday, and it was even worse than Linda Robinson had feared. "A game of greed," the cover blared over a picture of a thoughtful Ross Johnson, hand on chin. "This man could pocket $100 million from the largest corporate takeover in history," it read. "Has the buyout craze gone too far?" As bad as the cover was, the worst damage to Johnson was, as usual, self-inflicted. What about the outsize management agreement? "My job is to negotiate the best deal that I can for my people." Does a chief executive deserve that kind of reward? It's kind of monopoly money. Wouldn't lots of people lose their jobs? "Sure," Johnson said, "but the people that I have, particularly the Atlanta people, have very portable types of professions, accountants, lawyers, secretaries. It isn't that I would be putting them on the breadline. We have excellent severance arrangements." That wasn't quite true. The special committee wanted each bidder to include employee protection guarantees in their draft merger agreements, a notion the management group was stoutly resisting. The point would take on significance because a longtime employee was lobbying hard for the employee protections. Ward Miller, the special committee's secretary, was a longtime top legal officer for Johnson. The former vice president of Worry would now also turn on Johnson. Miller had joined Standard Brands fresh out of law school in 1961. Now he was fretting for all his many old colleagues who would be fired as Nabisco was broken up. In this lull between bidding rounds, he had a chance to do something about it. To each of the directors, Miller insisted on several points: guaranteeing pay and benefits of RJR Nabisco employees for 3 years, giving remaining employees the right to quit with sweet severance packages if they were forced by RJR's new owners to move more than 35 miles, assuring that retirees' medical benefits would continue. The Kohlberg-Kravis lawyers didn't like Miller's ideas, but they negotiated them. The management group's lawyers wouldn't budge. Miller went back to the board members and peevishly let them know it. The only employee Johnson seemed interested in was John Martin. He was beginning to lobby directors for a fat pension for a man who'd joined the company in January. Johnson talked to Hugel Monday afternoon. "I won't even ask you if this will be a fair bid," he said. "If you ask me, do I trust the people on the special committee? The answer is no." Hugel assured Johnson the process would be fair, but when he started to pound the restructuring drums again, Johnson cut him off. "Oh, come on, Charlie," he said. "That shit's getting pretty tiresome." Tuesday morning, Hugel was astounded to take a call in his hotel room from Johnson. He looked at the clock. It was 6:10. "What are you doing up?" Hugel asked. The only time Johnson was ever awake at 6 o'clock, he figured, was when he had stayed up all night. "We're trying to figure out what's going to happen on the bids," he said. The Shearson camp was divided, Johnson went on. Most thought Kravis was bowing out. A few, like Johnson, feared he might come in with a blockbuster bid. "I don't know what they're going to do," Johnson said. "What the hell are you asking me for?" Hugel said. "I don't know either. Just go as high as you can." On Tuesday morning, First Boston's bid hung in limbo. For hours, Seslow had assured Maher he would assemble his share of the pot. As Seslow scrambled, Mel Klein kept the Pritzkers updated. Jay was negotiating a cruise ship deal in Miami. Tom, who had suffered an ear injury in a scuba diving accident, couldn't fly and was marooned in a Los Angeles hotel. Both father and son worried that if Seslow cratered, First Boston would turn to them to make good on his pledge. And $400 million wasn't pocket change, not even to Jay Pritzker. "Be ready to make a decision," Klein counseled that morning. "Today is the day." That morning, Maher and his aides were busy arm-twisting senior officials at Chase Manhattan on the monetization proposal. They got nowhere. Klein's partner, Harry Gray, got the bank's chairman on the line, but the executive was leaving for Russia in less than an hour and wasn't inclined to spend the time overruling his senior credit officer. Maher was badly wounded. Without bank backing, Finn's idea was just that, an idea. Maher decided to lower his sights. If a bank wouldn't agree to fund the monetization proposal, First Boston had to get someone to vouch for the soundness of the idea. Maher needed something, anything, to give the board to convince them the project was workable. Mel Klein tried Bankers Trust, but was told it had no extra people to spare. Then, at noon, Harry Gray tried Citibank once more and struck pay dirt. A team would be over to First Boston at 2 o'clock. It was going to be close. The unenviable task of compiling First Boston's scattered documents and data into a single 3-inch-thick binder fell to 31-year-old Gordon Rich, a short, excitable banker with thinning brown hair. By Monday afternoon, Rich had no idea what form First Boston's bid would take: a merger, a recapitalization, or something else entirely. "Look, I'm running out of time here," he told a gathering in Maher's office. "I'm going back to my office and writing this deal now. If you guys don't tell me the deal, I'm submitting what I wrote, not what you agree on." Rich then stalked out. By 1 o'clock Tuesday morning, when Rich convened a meeting of lawyers in the 44th floor boardroom, he still hadn't calmed down. Going around the table one by one, each lawyer had something to say about a document in Rich's package. The speeches droned on and on. At such times, some men might count sheep. Gordon Rich counted lawyers. He got to 38 before losing his temper. "Look, if it's not vitally important, I don't want to hear it," Rich announced. "I don't care about every last little change. This will be done my way." All Monday night and into Tuesday morning, Rich stalked First Boston's halls, demanding the material he had to send to Atkins. "Shut the fuck up," he yelled at attorneys. "This is how we're doing it. If you want to complain, go to Maher." By early Tuesday afternoon, Rich was beside himself. For 4 days, he had pleaded with these people to deliver their work 24 hours ahead of time. Yet here it was, just hours to go, and he still didn't have half the documents he needed. Like some fairy tale troll, Rich began grabbing people as they walked by his office, demanding to know when their part of the package would be delivered. At the height of his frustration, he managed to snag Brian Finn. For some reason, Rich wouldn't remember why, speaking to Finn was vitally important. When a lawyer named Mike Rothfeld stuck his head into Rich's office and summoned Finn, Rich angrily objected. No, you can't have him," Rich shouted at Rothfeld. "Get out of here." When Finn rose to leave, Gordon Rich lost it. He grabbed his gray plastic phone, stretched the cord to its full length, and hurled the receiver against its console with all his strength. Both the receiver and the console were demolished. Finn and Rothfeld beat a hasty retreat. Afterward, Rich left his office and wandered through empty offices on the 41st floor. He was so tired, he thought about simply leaving the building. Figuring he'd probably be fired, Gordon Rich returned to his office to wait. The team from Citibank arrived at First Boston at 2 o'clock. For some reason, the bankers had come down from an office in New York's northern suburbs. With 3 hours to go, Fennebresque didn't have time to worry about itineraries and escorted the bankers upstairs to an unoccupied dining room. "Look, here's the situation," he explained to the bank team's leader. "In a few hours, we've got to put a bid in. One of the banks crapped out on us at the last minute. There's no doubt this bid is eminently financeable. There's no doubt once the logjam breaks, there will be bank money here. We'd like you to give us the strongest letter you can." For 90 minutes, Fennebresque briefed the bankers on First Boston's strategy. In case they didn't understand, he handed them a draft letter he had written. "Maybe something like that," he added. "Suggestions never hurt." All that day, Brian Finn wandered from room to room, grazing on sandwiches and answering questions. His duties were long over. Everything now was a matter of dollars and cents. Around 3 o'clock, Finn encountered Hank Handelsman in a hallway. Pritzker's lawyer was scowling. "Finn, I've got a big problem." "What's that?" "We're short $250 million. "You're what?" Finn was aghast. "What are you talking about?" "Seslow didn't deliver." The two men walked for a few minutes as the lawyer explained the depth of their predicament. They paused by an empty desk outside Maher's office. Inside, Finn could see a downcast Seslow issuing what must have been a series of mea culpas. The accountant walked out toward where Finn and Handelsman stood. He stopped, then turned away. Finn glanced at Handelsman. There was no mistaking the malice in the lawyer's glare. Handelsman turned to Finn as Seslow wandered off. "I could ask Jay for the money," the lawyer said, "but I'm not real excited about the prospect." "I don't know about that," Finn said, "but we don't send that letter without the equity." If the Pritzkers ponied up the money and won, both men knew they could syndicate most of it within days. Banks and institutional investors would be clamoring for a piece of the action. But that didn't put money in their pockets now. "You've really got no choice," Finn said. "You make the call to Jay, or we're out. Even with the equity, this thing's a long shot. Without it, we haven't got a snowball's chance in hell." Maher, too, rejected any suggestion of delivering a bid without equity commitments. Lacking the monetization commitment was bad enough. Lacking the down payment bordered on black comedy. Mel Klein now called around to a number of his fund's investors and managed to pick up $5 million here, $10 million there. It was pocket change. An hour before bids were due, they were still $200 million short. Everyone, Klein, Maher, Finn, and Handelsman, knew there was only one place that money could come from, if it came at all. The clock beside Jim Maher's desk read 4:15 when Mel Klein finally got the Pritzkers on the line. Klein quickly explained the situation. "Guys, we've got to make the commitment now. No one else can write a check for this in 5 minutes. There was silence on the other end of the line. Jay, Tom, we're here now, Klein said. We're ready to go. We need a commitment for another $200 million. Jay Pritzker spoke. Mel, is there another choice? Klein knew it was probably twice the largest commitment the Pritzker family had ever made. Klein was looking out the window. Jay, you're in Florida, and Tom, you're in California. I don't know if either of you is looking at the sunset. Klein turned to Maher, who stood unsmiling by his desk. I'm looking at Jim Maher, and there's only one thing he wants to hear to enable us to go forward with the First Boston offer, and that's, we need to hear you are behind the Resource Holdings equity. Again, there was silence on the line. Mel, that's a lot of money, Tom Pritzker said. I know, fellas. That's why I'm talking to you. We need to know. Is there any other alternative? Jay Pritzker asked again. No, not at this point. Are we morally obligated to First Boston for this? Tom Pritzker asked. Klein thought for a moment. He glanced at Maher. Yes. Do you think First Boston thinks we should step forward with the equity? Yes. There was a long silence. Mel Klein held his breath. Dad, Tom Pritzker began. I know, Jay Pritzker said. That's it. We'll do it. Klein exhaled. Thanks, guys. He hung up and turned to Maher, who stood by his desk like a cigar store Indian. That's it. The Pritzkers are committed for the whole thing. For the first time that day, Maher had a reason to smile. At 11 o'clock Tuesday morning, Kravis and Roberts met with their investment bankers, telling them in uncertain tones they hadn't decided whether they would bid that afternoon. Both men had their own ideas, but the last people they were telling them to were their investment bankers. With any luck, someone would unknowingly pass the misinformation within earshot of Peter Cohen. No one was concerned about First Boston. From his bank contacts, Kravis knew of Maher's mounting problems. Mel Klein had kept calling, and now it sounded as if First Boston might have some interest in a minority share of the Kohlberg-Kravis deal. Kravis knew a sign of weakness when he saw one. Through a clever ruse, they had also learned of a consensus forming among Atkins and the board attorneys that First Boston's monetization scheme was almost certainly unworkable. Dick Beatty had simply had his tax attorneys call up and ask about trying the same thing. Don't try it, they were told. It'll never work. Afterward, Kravis and Roberts convened the informal round table in Kravis's corner office. The associates were so tired of these talks, they dubbed them the Circle Jerks. Starting with Scott Stewart, they went around the room, each man offering his viewpoint one final time. Should we do it? Stewart and Cliff Robbins gave qualified thumbs-ups. Ted Ammon was on the fence. Bob McDonnell, the general partner from San Francisco, pushed hard, extolling at length the values of brand names like Oreo, Nabisco, and Ritz. Paul Rather was ready to bid. So was Henry Kravis. After a week of keeping his own counsel, Kravis was prepared to lead the final charge. No one in the room was surprised. Those who knew Kravis best never believed he could let go a deal this size. And if we bid, Kravis emphasized, we bid to win. Finally, George Roberts spoke. I think we should all ask ourselves, is this really worth all the headaches? Do we really want to do this to ourselves? We're going to take a lot of heat from Washington, a lot of heat from our partners. Roberts looked at each man in the room as he spoke. The one thing I don't want to see happen is for this company to get in trouble. It could end the whole thing, the whole industry. I'm just not comfortable with the idea we have to do this deal. Roberts's speech left them at an impasse. It wasn't often that Kravis and Roberts openly disagreed. Several in the room exchanged anxious looks. What now? Look, Kravis said, we founded this firm on the basis that George and I are going to agree on everything, or we're not going to do it at all. He turned to Roberts. "Maybe we ought to go off and talk about this ourselves for a while." Roberts nodded. For a moment, the deal teetered there. Then Jamie Green spoke. Green, an associate in San Francisco, was in charge of assembling the billions in bank money Kohlberg Kravis would need if it bought RJR Nabisco. Among the Kravis troops, that gave Green's opinions added weight. "Wait a minute, just wait a minute," Green said. "George, I just really think we ought to do this deal. Sure, it's going to be tough to do, but I think this is a wonderful deal." It was the single gung-ho statement Roberts had been looking for days, and it changed the whole mood. Within minutes, they moved from discussing if they would bid to how much they would bid. "Okay," Roberts said, "if we're going to do this, it's got to be safe. It's got to be a lot less cash than we've been talking about. At the end of the day, the board's not going to be too concerned with $3 or $4 more in cash. They're going to look at the higher value. And if it's close," Roberts continued, "we'll win." For hours, they worked on refining a financial structure, opting for safety by boosting the share of PIC securities and reducing the actual cash paid to shareholders. Several times, an anxious Dick Beatty stuck his head into the room. "Damn it, give me the bid," he said. "Time is running out here." "Go away, Dick," Roberts said, smiling. "All you have to do is change a few numbers. We'll let you know." Peter Cohen convened the management group that afternoon at Shearson. Everyone had an idea where the bid should be. Johnson's aides, Benevento and Sage, were throwing around numbers in the vicinity of $110 a share, but as usual, no one listened to them. Cohen and John Goodfriend had the only opinions that mattered. Cohen later said he favored a bid of $102, maybe $103. Goodfriend, wary to the end about deal heat, actually wanted to reduce the bid, maybe $97, $98. In the end, they split the difference. $100 a share, simply repeating their earlier bid, was felt to be a slap in the board's face. The group believed some kind of raise was in order, if only to allow directors to save face for having extended the auction deadline. It wouldn't do to further alienate the board, no doubt already incensed at Johnson's time debacle. In the end, Cohen and Goodfriend settled on $101, a $1 bump. Later, the strategy behind the bid would be hotly debated. Did Cohen and the others genuinely believe Kravis was bowing out of the bidding? "There's no question we were fooled," recalled Jack Nussbaum, Cohen's attorney and confidant. "No question. How could anyone say anything else?" According to Nussbaum, the key was Dick Beatty's call to Cohen. "That's what bagged us," he said. "Beatty's clear indication was that they were through. When he said it, Peter believed it. We figured Kravis wouldn't be there. We figured our only competition was First Boston." Chas Phillips, the Solomon banker, recalled that Hill felt the strongest that KKR wasn't there. Hill reluctantly concurs. "With Henry going to Vail," he said, "there was a good sense that Henry was not hot on the case. That, in fact, was an excellent head fake." As for Cohen, Hill says, Peter firmly believed that KKR was not there. In his roots, he really did believe it. According to Hill, when Cohen returned to New York from Brussels, he said he had reason to believe from Dick Beatty that KKR was out of it. Despite the recollections of Hill, Nussbaum, and others, Cohen insists he never believed Kravis had given up. "I always thought he was there," Cohen said. "Hill was very cocky and sure he wasn't going to be there. I told him we're not going to make that assumption. I believed Henry was going to be there. He goes to Vail for Thanksgiving every year. Actually, it was only Kravis's second Vail Thanksgiving. All you had to have was a fax machine and you were in business." Debate aside, the truest indication of the management group's belief was its final bid. Any competitor seeking RJR Nabisco would naturally seek to top the $100 bid already on the table. Cohen's $101 was a tacit confirmation that, Just as they had in the weeks before their initial announcement, the management group once again expected no competition. It was, said Nussbaum, our fatal error. At First Boston, Fennebresque hovered over the Citibank team all afternoon. All he needed was a letter saying Finn's idea was doable. He felt like an expectant father outside the delivery room. Every 10 minutes, it seemed, the phone outside the dining room rang. "Where's the letter? Where's the goddamn letter?" "Hold on, just hold on," Fennebresque repeated. "We're trying to get it." It was after 4:30 when the Citibank team leader emerged from the dining room. Fennebresque was pacing nervously outside. "Thanks," Fennebresque said, taking the letter and shaking the banker's hand. "Thanks a lot." The letter was quickly inserted into the bid packet, which was then messengered over to Skadden. In its wake, Jim Maher was philosophical. The packet was nowhere near what he expected to produce. The monetization letter was, well, less than he had hoped. He told himself it had been a valiant effort. Their chances of success seemed minuscule, but, Maher reasoned, he had beaten long odds before, just 9 days earlier. "Shit," he said. "Maybe it'll happen again." George Roberts's head was bowed as he entered the Kohlberg-Kravis boardroom a few minutes before 5 o'clock. Arrayed before him, a dozen of Wall Street's highest-paid investment bankers waited anxiously for news of Kohlberg-Kravis's bid. Each of the bankers wondered the same thing. Would Roberts and Kravis throw up another dead duck? Or did they want to win? As much as each would later brag of having Kravis's ear, the truth was that few had a clue what the two would do. The answer meant tens of millions of dollars in fees to every banker in the room. Roberts, with Kravis at his side, was the picture of dejection, head slowly shaking, eyes downcast, hands deep in his pockets. He addressed the group in funereal tones. "We're sorry," he said. "We decided to forget it. It was just too much." He paused a time or two to let the message sink in. "We just couldn't get there." The room fell utterly silent, the sound of $100 million in fees slowly evaporating. Roberts sighed. "What did we bid, Henry? I think it was 106. Is that right?" Kravis nodded. "I think that's right." Standing to one side, Dick Beatty would never forget the banker's reaction when the charade was unveiled. You could see the dollar signs light up in their eyes, he would recall. It was like, "Woo! We're back in the ball game, yeah!" Invigorated, they all sat back to wait. Chapter 17. Spirits were high in the Shearson camp. Despite the Time cover, despite the avalanche of bad publicity, despite the obvious ill will among board members, Cohen and Hill were convinced they were on the verge of victory. No one gave Kravis much thought. Everything now depended on First Boston. If the board bought Jim Maher's bizarre scheme, First Boston would win. Few believed that would happen, but if it did, so be it. No one could compete with the returns Maher was promising. There was a real good feeling, Jack Nussbaum recalled. We'd either be blown away by First Boston, or we'd win. An hour after submitting its bid Tuesday afternoon, the management group scattered. Cohen, thinking they might hear news by 8 o'clock, ducked out to dinner to celebrate his 20th wedding anniversary with his wife and children. He was back at Willkie Farr by 8. John Goodfriend led a group of Solomon bankers to dinner at Christ Cella, a midtown steakhouse, where they ran into Citibank's chairman John Reed. They too were at Willkie Farr by 8 o'clock. By 6 o'clock, there had been no call. By 7, there had been no call. By 8, there was still no call. No one at Willkie Farr was particularly worried. Goodfriend and Jim Stern started a poker game. Some of the Solomon bankers sat in a corner reading the latest Car and Driver and Road and Track. By 9, Cohen and Nussbaum were on the phone to Goldstone, who remained at his downtown office, well away from the Solomon contingent. All three were growing nervous. If Kravis was out, and First Boston was really an airball, they should have heard something by now. Gutfriend, too, was growing impatient. Despite his mounting poker winnings, he had managed to shake nearly $400 out of Stern and Bob O'Brien of Bankers Trust. As always, Gutfriend hated being kept in the dark. "How come we never know what's going on?" he groused. Jim and Linda Robinson dashed out to a black-tie dinner that evening at the Marriott Marquis in Midtown Manhattan. Texaco Chief James Kinnear, a client and good friend of Linda's, was being honored at another boys' club ceremony. Among those at the Robinsons' table was Eric Gleacher of Morgan Stanley, who also worked with Texaco. Gleacher noticed the aerial of a portable phone protruding from Jim Robinson's tuxedo pocket and grinned. Before dinner, Linda Robinson attempted to ease the suspense with small talk. "So," she asked Gleacher, "what did you guys bid?" Gleacher demurred. He had guessed Linda might want to play this game. She probably thought he would actually tell her what Henry Kravis had offered. "Oh, come on, it's over," she pressed. "You can tell me." Gleacher shrugged. If she wanted to play games, he would play along. 94, he said with a straight face. They didn't raise the bid. He paused. "What did you guys bid?" "What do you think?" "Kind of where you were before?" "Yeah," Linda Robinson said. "That's pretty close." For those gathered at Kohlberg Kravis, the waiting was agony. The halls were filled with pacing investment bankers. There was nothing to do but wait. After a couple of hours, pizza was ordered. Then, a few minutes before 9 o'clock, Dick Beatty took a call from Peter Atkins. "We'd like you and some of your team to come over," Atkins said. Beatty fought the urge to grow excited. "Are we the only one getting called?" he asked. "Is the other side being invited over as well?" "I can't answer questions like that." The two lawyers talked for several minutes about who would be needed at Skadden. Only lawyers and associates, the detail squadron, would be needed for the moment. Beatty, eyeing the pizzas, had one last concern. "You guys got food over there?" "Yeah," Atkins said. Beatty relayed news of the call to Kravis. Kravis, too, held his excitement. They had been through this drill before. Told they wouldn't be needed at Skadden, Kravis and the four general partners headed out to dinner at an East Side Italian restaurant, Campagnola. As they did, Beatty hastily assembled a small squad of lawyers, investment bankers, and associates for the trip to Skadden Arps. The group left in pairs so as not to arouse suspicion if the management group had lookouts posted in the lobby. Once downstairs, Cliff Robbins detoured briefly to have a private word with a security guard. Robbins wanted to make sure that, if Johnson also left the building, Kravis knew about it quickly. Kravis had just ordered dinner when he was called from his table to the phone. It was Beatty. "They're going to want you to come over here in about 45 minutes. "Well, we're eating. We'll be there." "We're in good shape," Beatty said. "Things look good. Felix is waiting for you here." For the first time, Kravis allowed himself to sense victory. He returned to the table and excitedly passed on the news. "Things are looking good," he said, smiling. Everyone felt a victory was within their grasp. Kravis was halfway through dinner when he was pulled away to take another call. It was Beatty again. "God damn it, where are you guys?" "We thought we'd eat dinner," Kravis said. "Felix is getting impatient." We're coming. "Come on, Henry. They want to get this thing done and get out of here." Okay, we'll be there in a minute." Mildly irritated, Kravis returned to the table. "They really want us to go down there now," he said. "I guess Felix wants to go home early tonight." After hurriedly finishing dinner, the 5 general partners piled into Kravis's blue Mercedes 500. They were at Skadden within minutes. Upstairs, Kravis, Roberts, and Rather were escorted into a conference room where they were met by Felix Roeden, Ira Harris, and Peter Atkins. Kravis looked for signs of the management group, but saw none. Roeden began reeling through a list of open issues. Lazard and Dillon, he said, wanted to learn more about the securities Kravis proposed to include in his offer. There were some other points, all minor. Then Roeden asked, "Is this your best offer?" "Yes," Kravis said. "Well, if we can work out the securities and get comfortable with regard to the financing, we are prepared to recommend your bid to the special committee." Kravis and Roberts broke into smiles. A winner. After 6 weeks, Kravis and Roberts were on the brink of victory. All that remained were 2 sets of final negotiations. A Kravis lawyer, Robert Spatt, headed to an upstairs conference room to negotiate the merger agreement. The investment bankers were issued into another room to explain the bid's securities. There, Lazard and Dillon hailed them with questions, including, one final time, what Kravis would do in the event Drexel were indicted. With any luck, Kravis figured, both sets of talks could be wrapped up in a few hours. The committee was scheduled to meet the next morning to make its recommendation. With nothing else to do, Kravis and Roberts sat back to wait. Once the meetings were underway, Atkins headed upstairs to his office. A stack of phone messages awaited him there. The first call he returned was to Jim Maher. For all the Sturm und Drang, First Boston's final bid had been quickly dismissed. Practically all the key questions about the initial proposal, such as the timing of antitrust approvals, remained unresolved. The fatal flaw was the monetization letter. First Boston had nothing resembling a solid bank commitment to back it. What Maher sent, in fact, prompted peals of laughter among the committee's investment bankers. The Citibank letter Fennebresque had worked so hard to procure had only a typed letterhead, and that from a Citibank office on Mamaroneck Avenue in Harrison, New York. It had been signed by a vice president. It was hardly what the committee had been looking for. Maher, at home in his West Side apartment, hadn't been able to stand the waiting any longer. "Peter," he said when Atkins called, "I'm sitting here, this is killing me. Should I sit up waiting, or can I go to bed?" "Nah," Atkins said. "I think you can go to sleep." Maher knew the truth then. He had fallen one miracle short. "Well," he said, "that's too bad." Maher hung up and called one of his aides, Gordon Rich. "I think we're done, Gordo. I think we're done." Where was the call? Where was Atkins? As the evening wore on, Steve Goldstone paced his office nervously. No news, he told himself, was bad news. Something has gone wrong. Maybe they're taking First Boston seriously, he thought. God forbid, maybe Kravis bid. Where were they? As he paced, Goldstone indulged a nervous habit that never failed to irk his colleagues. At times of high stress, he took to squeezing the erasers off the ends of number 2 pencils. Sometimes he pressed so hard the tiny pink dots popped across the room and bounced off people's foreheads. That night, Goldstone's office floor was littered with severed eraser heads. By 9:30, Goldstone could stand the suspense no longer. First, he phoned his partner, Dennis Hirsch, at home. Goldstone put Hirsch on a speakerphone to listen as he called Atkins. The Skadden lawyer, just finishing his conversation with Jim Maher, returned the call minutes later. "Peter, I've got a pile of people waiting around," Goldstone said. "Are you guys going to make a decision tonight? Do we need to be waiting around?" "I'd say there's no reason for your people to hang around tonight," Atkins said. "We'll be in touch with you tomorrow." The words were a splash of ice water in Goldstone's face. "What are you saying? What does that mean?" Anxiety crept into Goldstone's voice. "Are we out of it?" Atkins was a blank wall. "Look, I can't say any more." Goldstone persisted. "Are we out of it?" "Look," Atkins said, All I can tell you is we don't need you tonight. You can tell your people to go home." Goldstone's call sent electric shocks through the gathering at Willkie Farr. The poker game was forgotten. The car magazines were tossed in a corner. Worried looks broke out as questions swept the group loitering at Nussbaum's office. What does that mean? What's going on? Minutes later, the group suffered a second, greater shock. Nussbaum took a call from a reporter who passed along the information that Kravis had just been summoned to Skadden Arps. Had Shearson? "No," Nussbaum stammered. "We haven't." Nussbaum was thunderstruck. Kravis? He couldn't believe it. Peter Cohen couldn't believe it either. All at once he knew something had gone terribly, terribly wrong. Chaos broke out among the advisors at Willkie Farr. Everyone had an idea what had happened, what to do. Gutfriend, having pocketed his poker winnings, angrily demanded that someone, anyone, get over to Skadden right away. "This is bullshit," Gutfriend railed. "Get in there. Just get somebody in there. Here we are standing around playing with ourselves. Let's get someone in there." Nussbaum thought quickly. Something had to be done fast. A letter. That was the answer. As many lawyers do when nursing a grievance, Nussbaum knew it was important to get their anger down into writing. As Cohen and the investment bankers shouted and cursed around him, he began dictating. Bob Hope had almost finished the evening's program at the Boys' Club dinner when Linda Robinson was called from the table for an urgent telephone call. Excusing herself, she hustled into the Marriott's kitchen to take it. When she returned, Eric Gleacher could tell she was fuming. "She knows where we are," he thought. Gleacher couldn't help but smile. The moment the program ended, the Robinsons were up and away from the table. Linda Robinson had one parting line for the Morgan Stanley banker. "Gleacher," she said, "you're a fucking liar." There was the wisp of a smile on her lips. Gleacher looked Jim Robinson's wife square in the eyes. "Linda, you just don't get it, do you? There's just no way this board is going to give this company to Ross Johnson." Johnson, Horrigan, and the rest of the RJR Nabisco executives were passing the time over drinks at 9 West when they heard the news. Bit by bit, reports dribbled in, and they were all bad. Atkins had told Goldstone he could go home, and Kravis was invited to Skadden. If that weren't bad enough, Bill Liss, still supposedly representing the special committee, called and said he had been asked to ready a public announcement the next morning. The signs of defeat were unmistakable. "That's it. Lights out," Johnson said. "As far as I'm concerned, it's sayonara." When Goldstone heard Kravis was at Skadden Arps, he immediately redialed Atkins. $20 billion, and more than a few careers, maybe even his own, were on the line. Atkins put him on the squawk box. Soon the lawyer's office was filled with the anguished tones of Goldstone's voice. The management group had been cheated, Goldstone insisted. They had been placed in an untenable position, indeed robbed of victory, by that lunatic First Boston bid. As the first round's high bidder, they had no incentive to boost their offer. In essence, Goldstone argued, they were forced to bid against themselves. To be fair, he insisted, there had to be another, final round of bidding. "We're not done," Goldstone insisted, pacing amid the eraser heads littering his office floor. "Peter, we're willing to bid more. We'll bid more. What is this nonsense about starting an auction and shutting it down an hour later? There are no rules governing these procedures. We put in a bid saying we'll bid more, and we will. How can you do this? It's not fair." Atkins tried to calm the feverish lawyer, but got nowhere. "Peter, you've got to keep the bidding open. You've got to keep the bidding open as long as people are willing to bid." For 45 minutes, Goldstone pounded at the same theme, and Atkins, emotionless, assured Goldstone his arguments would be taken into account. But there was nothing he, Atkins, could do until the committee met the next morning. Privately, Atkins and the Skadden litigator, Mike Mitchell, found Goldstone's argument no more persuasive than others he had made over the past 6 weeks. The crux of Goldstone's case seemed to be that management was entitled to 2 out of 3 falls. A few minutes before 11 o'clock, as his impassioned soliloquy stretched on, Goldstone mentioned to Atkins that he would be receiving a letter of protest from Jack Nussbaum. "The letter has been tempered somewhat," Goldstone allowed. "But Peter, you've got to understand. People are bouncing off the walls over here. They're really upset." At 11 o'clock, the letter was delivered to Atkins's office. "I've got it now," he told Goldstone, glad for the excuse to end the lawyer's pleas. "We'll get back to you later." Atkins hung up and looked at Nussbaum's letter. It was on the stationery of the lawyer's firm, Wilkie, Farr and Gallagher. "Gentlemen, during the last several hours we have been receiving regular reports from the press advising us of the precise nature of the bid submitted today on behalf of the management group, as well as periodic reports that you or your representatives have met earlier this evening with representatives of another bidding group whose bid, if the reports we are receiving are accurate, has seemed to improve as the evening has progressed. We believe that the management group has been disadvantaged throughout the entire process, and we must now insist that if you are talking to other bidders, you must talk to us as well, so that we have an opportunity to consider our response to any bid which may exceed ours, just as other bidding groups had an opportunity to bid against our winning bid, which you published on November 18th. Our letter to you today indicated a willingness to discuss all aspects of our proposal. We reiterate that willingness and look forward to the opportunity to continue the bidding process, if that is appropriate, in the full light of day with details of all the present bids being known to all parties. The members of the management group are at the offices of the undersigned and would appreciate a prompt telephonic response to this letter. Sincerely, Jack Nussbaum." Atkins set down the letter and frowned. It was going to be another long night. With their protest issued, the group at Wilkie Farr cooled down and awaited a response. Clusters of tired men stood talking in the halls. In Nussbaum's conference room, Goodfriend sat in one corner, reading the latest copy of Manhattan Inc. A few people dozed off. George Scheinberg of Shearson showed up and passed around a handful of cigars. For an hour, there was peace. At 9 West, the Robinsons joined the group in Horrigan's corner office. The couple's formal attire prompted a round of jokes from Johnson. "A bottle of white and a bottle of red," he requested of the tuxedoed Robinson. There was little to do but wait. From time to time, Johnson tried to reach Charlie Hugel at his hotel room. Maybe, he thought, Hugel could make some sense of all this. Having missed dinner, Hugel was starved. Shortly after 11 o'clock, he left Skadden for his suite at the Regency, where he prowled the lobby looking for a restaurant. Finding none open, he went up to his room and, stomach growling, prepared for bed. Minutes later, his phone rang. "Mr. Johnson would like to speak with you," a secretary's voice said. Hugel sat on hold, waiting for Johnson to pick up. As he did, the telephone's second line glowed red. Putting Johnson's secretary on hold, he punched the button to take the incoming line. It was Peter Atkins, who quickly briefed Hugel on Goldstone's angry call. He warned him that the management group was on the warpath and might contact him. "They're really pissed," Atkins said. So that's what Johnson wants, Hugel thought. He noticed the red light showing Johnson's call had gone off. Hugel hung up and dialed back 9 West. When Johnson came on the line, Hugel could tell he was upset, but the first thing out of Johnson's mouth had nothing to do with losing the largest takeover in history. "We've heard they're going to cancel the Golden Parachutes," Johnson said. "Is that true?" Hugel was surprised. Could he have heard Johnson right? Golden Parachutes? With the fate of his company hanging in the balance, Johnson was fretting about his severance benefits? Hugel suspected Ed Horrigan had put him up to it. It sounded like vintage Horrigan. "That's ridiculous," Hugel said. "What would make you think we're doing that? Anyway, Ross, I'm not exactly worried about that right now, you know? We're all a little more concerned about the future of the company." "Well," Johnson asked, instinctively avoiding controversy, "what's going on? I understand our people have been told to go home. Would you like to embellish that a little?" Hugel chuckled. "Well, remember our phone conversation this morning?" "Yeah. Well, they bid." "You mean a blockbuster bid?" "Yes." "Well, how much of a blockbuster?" "I really can't tell you." Just talking to Johnson, they both knew, amounted to a breach of the auction process. "Are we talking in the neighborhood of $5? Johnson asked. "Yes." "You mean 106? "You hit it." There was a snort of disbelief from Johnson. "Well, okay, we're out of it," he said. "That's the end. God bless him." Johnson, alone in Horrigan's office with Jim Robinson, put down the phone. There was a moment of silence as he digested the news. Finally, he said, "It's over." Together, the two men walked into Horrigan's anteroom, where Horrigan, Linda Robinson, and the others were waiting impatiently. "Well, what's the news?" someone asked. "What did he say?" "Look, it's over," Johnson said quietly. "Let's just say this is where it ended." A cacophony of voices assaulted Johnson. "What do you mean? What do you mean? What did he say? How much did they bid?" In no time, Horrigan was raging at the board, at Kravis, at everything. Everyone in the room wanted to know what Hugel had said, what had happened. "Listen, I can't tell you," Johnson said. "I gotta respect Charlie's confidence. But," he added, "the spread is substantial." A few minutes later, Johnson called Peter Cohen and the group at Wilkie Farr. Jack Nussbaum put him on a speakerphone in his conference room. "It's all over," Johnson said. "KK